In his final days, as his body weakened but his mind remained as brilliant as ever, Stephen Hawking was reportedly working on one last theory, a culmination of his life's work that would bridge quantum physics with our understanding of consciousness. According to close associates, Hawking had been developing these ideas for years but kept them private, concerned about how they might be received by the scientific community. These final thoughts weren't published in academic journals or presented at conferences. Instead, they were shared with only his closest confidants and family members. Why would one of history's most transparent scientists choose to keep such profound insights hidden? Perhaps because they ventured beyond conventional science into territory that challenged our fundamental understanding of reality. Hawking had always been fascinated by the boundary between physics and philosophy. While publicly maintaining a materialist stance throughout his career, those closest to him witnessed how his thinking evolved in his final years. As he faced his own mortality, the question of what happens to consciousness after death became more than theoretical. It became personal. The universe reveals itself in layers, Hawking allegedly wrote in one of his final notes. What we perceive as death may simply be consciousness transitioning to a different layer of reality, one that operates according to quantum principles rather than classical ones. Tonight, we'll explore this hidden intellectual journey, how a scientist who once declared that brain activity ceases with death came to consider that consciousness might transcend physical boundaries. We'll examine recently discovered documents, interviews with those who knew him best, and the scientific principles that led to what might be Hawking's most revolutionary idea, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. To understand the significance of Hawking's final thoughts, we must first recognize the distinct difference between his public persona and private contemplations. The Stephen Hawking most people knew was the author of A Brief History of Time, the scientist who declared that the universe needed no creator, who compared the human brain to a computer that would simply shut down after death. This public position aligned with mainstream physics. Consciousness was merely an emergent property of neurological processes, and when those processes ceased, so too would our awareness. It was a clean, materialist view that avoided the messiness of metaphysics and aligned with observable evidence. But privately, Hawking wrestled with questions that transcended traditional scientific boundaries. According to Professor Martin Rees, the UK's Astronomer Royal and Hawking's longtime colleague, Stephen's mind always operated on multiple levels. While he publicly advocated for positions that could be experimentally verified, he privately explored the philosophical implications of quantum physics that might never be testable. This tension became more pronounced in Hawking's final years as he confronted his own mortality. While maintaining his public scientific persona, his private notes and conversations revealed a man increasingly fascinated by quantum theories of consciousness, theories that suggested awareness might be fundamental to the universe rather than merely a biological phenomenon. The division between mind and matter is an artificial one, Hawking wrote in 2016 in a personal journal recently discovered among his effects. At the quantum level, the observer cannot be separated from the observed. If consciousness participates in determining reality at the quantum level, perhaps reality continues to be shaped by consciousness even after what we call death. These private musings didn't represent a conversion to religious thinking. Hawking remained steadfastly skeptical of traditional religious concepts to the end. Rather, they reflected his growing interest in what quantum physics might reveal about consciousness itself, and how the strange properties of quantum systems might allow for forms of awareness that transcend our conventional understanding of life and death. Before diving into Hawking's specific theories, we need to understand the scientific concepts that form their foundation. While traditional neuroscience views consciousness as emerging from neural activity, quantum theories of consciousness propose something more radical, that quantum processes in the brain might be central to awareness, and these processes might connect to quantum fields that extend beyond our physical bodies. These aren't fringe ideas. Renowned physicists like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed that quantum effects in brain structures called microtubules could be the seat of consciousness. According to this model, consciousness arises from quantum computations in these structures, computations that may be connected to fundamental aspects of space-time geometry. Hawking was initially skeptical of these theories but became increasingly intrigued by them in his final years. His expertise in black hole physics and quantum mechanics gave him unique insights into how information might be preserved even when it appears to be destroyed. a concept with profound implications for consciousness after death. Information is never truly lost in the universe. Hawking wrote in notes dated just months before his passing. It may be transformed, scrambled, or hidden from view, but it persists. If consciousness is, at its root, a form of information processing that operates at the quantum level, there's no reason to assume it simply vanishes when the brain ceases to function. This represents a remarkable evolution in Hawking's thinking. His groundbreaking work on black hole evaporation had shown that information seemingly lost in a black hole might actually be preserved in subtle quantum correlations. In his final years, he began to wonder if a similar principle might apply to the information patterns that constitute our conscious experience. What if consciousness doesn't emerge from the brain, but is instead received and processed by it, like a television set receiving broadcast signals? This question, found in Hawking's personal notes from 2017, reflects his growing interest in the filter theory of consciousness, which suggests the brain might be more of a receiver than a producer of awareness. A theory that opens the door to the possibility that consciousness might continue even when the physical receiver breaks down. One of Hawking's most significant scientific contributions was his work on the black hole information paradox, the question of whether information that falls into a black hole is truly destroyed or somehow preserved. Initially, Hawking believed information was lost, but he later revised his position, concluding that information must be preserved, even if transformed. In his final years, Hawking began to draw parallels between this paradox and the question of consciousness after death. According to Dr. Elaine Richardson, a physicist who collaborated with Hawking in his final months, Stephen saw striking similarities between information seemingly lost in black holes and consciousness seemingly lost at death. His final work suggested both might be preserved in ways we don't yet fully understand. This connection hinged on Hawking's developing view of consciousness as a specific pattern of information processing rather than merely a physical phenomenon. In quantum mechanics, information about a system state is fundamental and cannot truly be destroyed. It can only be transformed or redistributed. If consciousness is fundamentally information-based rather than substance-based, Hawking wrote, then the cessation of brain activity wouldn't necessarily mean the end of the conscious pattern. The information that constitutes you might be preserved in the quantum structure of the universe itself. This concept aligns with what physicists call quantum non-locality, the idea that particles that have interacted remain connected regardless of distance. Hawking considered whether the quantum information patterns that constitute our consciousness might similarly remain connected to the wider universe even after death. We know from quantum entanglement that information can be shared across vast distances instantaneously, Hawking noted. Perhaps death is less of an ending and more of a phase transition, a redistribution of the quantum information that constitutes the conscious self into the broader information field of the universe. This viewpoint doesn't suggest an afterlife in the traditional sense, but rather a continuation of the conscious pattern in a form we can't yet comprehend, a preservation of self at the quantum level that transcends the biological mechanisms that originally generated it. It's less about survival of a soul and more about the persistence of information patterns that constitute identity. Among Hawking's most fascinating final considerations was how his earlier work on multiverse theory might relate to consciousness persistence. Throughout his career, Hawking had explored the possibility that our universe might be just one of many in a vast multiverse, each with slightly different physical laws and different versions of reality. In his final months, Hawking began connecting this concept to questions about consciousness. According to notes found on his computer after his death, he had been exploring whether consciousness might somehow be distributed across multiple universes, with our awareness in this universe representing just one facet of a larger transuniversal consciousness. If parallel universes exist as quantum mechanics suggests, Hawking wrote, then versions of ourselves may exist across multiple realities. When consciousness appears to end in one universe, perhaps it continues in others, not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a natural consequence of quantum reality. This wasn't mysticism, but an extension of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that all possible outcomes of quantum measurements occur in separate worlds or universes. Hawking considered whether consciousness might be entangled across these parallel realities, creating a form of quantum immortality. Dr. Raymond Laflamme, a former student of Hawking's who pioneered quantum computing, explains, Stephen was exploring whether consciousness might be like a quantum wave function that never truly collapses to a single point but exists simultaneously across multiple realities. In this view, what we experience as death might simply be a decoupling from this particular universe, while awareness continues elsewhere. This theory doesn't require any supernatural elements. It's a natural extension of quantum physics. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon operating across multiple universes, then what appears to be its termination in our universe would be merely a local event, not the end of the conscious entity itself. Perhaps when we die, Hawking speculated in a private conversation with his daughter Lucy, recorded in her journal, our consciousness doesn't vanish but transitions to experiencing primarily through our parallel selves. What appears as death might simply be a shift in the center of conscious gravity from one universe to others where that consciousness continues. Time was always central to Hawking's work. His groundbreaking research on black holes revealed how gravity warps time itself, and how time as we understand it ceases to have meaning at the quantum level. In his final reflections, Hawking applied these insights to consciousness and death. Our perception of time as linear is an illusion created by our macroscopic perspective, Hawking noted in what would be some of his final written thoughts. At the quantum level, past, present, and future exist simultaneously. If consciousness has a quantum aspect, then it may exist outside our conventional understanding of time. This connects to what physicists call the block universe theory, the idea that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and our experience of time passing is merely how we perceive our movement through this four-dimensional reality. If consciousness interacts with reality at the quantum level, it might not be bound by our conventional understanding of time. Death appears final only from within our time-bound perspective, Hawking wrote. From a higher dimensional viewpoint, the pattern that constitutes you might exist permanently as part of the universal wave function, outside time rather than ending in time. Professor Thorne, a longtime colleague of Hawking and fellow theoretical physicist, explains, Stephen was considering whether consciousness might be like a hologram that appears three-dimensional but is actually encoded in a two-dimensional surface. Similarly, what appears to us as a life with a beginning and end might actually be fully encoded in the quantum structure of space-time, existing all at once rather than moment by moment. This view suggests that our lives might not be truly finite, but rather eternal when viewed from outside our temporal perspective. Consciousness after death wouldn't be a continuation in time, but an existence beyond time, what religions have often described as eternity, but understood through the lens of physics rather than theology. Perhaps consciousness doesn't continue after death in the sense of moving forward in time, Hawking speculated. Instead, it might exist complete and whole outside of time altogether, with death being merely the point where our time-bound perception ceases, while the complete pattern remains intact in the timeless quantum substrate of reality. If consciousness does persist beyond death in some form, as Hawking was considering, wouldn't there be observable evidence? This question preoccupied Hawking in his final months, leading him to examine research that might provide empirical support for his theoretical musings. Contrary to popular belief, there is scientific research in this area, though it remains controversial. Hawking reviewed studies on near-death experiences, NDEs, examining them not as supernatural events but as potentially revealing phenomena about consciousness at the boundary of life and death. The consistency of near-death experiences across cultures and throughout history suggests they may be telling us something fundamental about consciousness, Hawking wrote. The reports of continued awareness when brain activity has ceased present a genuine scientific puzzle that deserves serious investigation rather than dismissal. Hawking was particularly interested in verified cases where individuals reported accurate observations during periods of clinical death when their brains showed no activity. From a conventional neuroscience perspective, such observations should be impossible, yet they've been documented in peer-reviewed medical literature. He also examined research on terminal lucidity, cases where people with severe brain damage or dementia experience unexpected mental clarity shortly before death. These cases suggest that consciousness may not be as dependent on normal brain function as we typically assume, he noted. If severely damaged brains can temporarily support clear consciousness before death, perhaps consciousness itself has properties that transcend normal neurological functioning. Hawking also considered the work of researchers like Dr. Dean Radin and Dr. Julie Bichel, who have conducted controlled studies on anomalous information transfer that suggest consciousness might not be entirely localized to the brain. While cautious about such research, Hawking noted, "The evidence, while not conclusive, is substantial enough that it cannot be dismissed without investigation. Scientific progress often begins at the boundaries of what we think we know." "I'm not suggesting we've proven consciousness survives death," Hawking clarified in notes to colleagues. "I'm suggesting there's enough anomalous evidence that challenges our current models that we should be investigating these phenomena rigorously rather than dismissing them based on our current paradigm, which history shows us is always incomplete." In the months before his death, Hawking was working on what his assistants called the final equation, an attempt to mathematically model how consciousness might interface with quantum reality and potentially transcend physical death. This work remained unfinished at his passing, but the fragments reveal a bold attempt to unify quantum physics, information theory, and consciousness studies. The equation, which combined elements of quantum field theory with information mathematics, suggested that consciousness might be understood as a specific pattern of information processing that interacts with quantum fields in a way that isn't entirely dependent on the physical substrate performing the processing. The mathematics suggests that consciousness might be better understood as a field phenomenon rather than a strictly localized one. Hawking wrote in his notes on the equation, "If consciousness operates even partially at the quantum level, then it may have non-local properties that allow aspects of it to persist independent of the brain." This perspective aligns with emerging theories in quantum biology, which suggest that living systems may harness quantum effects like entanglement and tunneling. Hawking's innovation was to extend these ideas to consciousness itself, suggesting that our awareness might be partially entangled with quantum fields that extend beyond our physical bodies. What we experience as consciousness may be the brain's translation of a deeper quantum reality into classical terms we can understand, Hawking proposed. Death may not end consciousness, but rather end this particular translation process, allowing the quantum aspects of consciousness to persist in forms we can't currently comprehend from our classical perspective. Professor Kaku, who reviewed portions of Hawking's final work, explains, "Stephen was suggesting that consciousness might exist in a superposition of states, partly localized in the brain but also extended into the quantum fields that permeate reality. If this is true, then what we call death might simply collapse the localized portion while the extended portion remains." The mathematics of this theory remains incomplete and speculative, but it represents a serious attempt by one of history's greatest scientific minds to address what happens to consciousness when we die, not through religion or mysticism, but through extending our understanding of quantum physics and information theory to their logical conclusions. As we conclude our exploration of Stephen Hawking's final thoughts on consciousness after death, it's important to emphasize that these ideas weren't presented as definitive answers but as provocative questions and possibilities, an invitation to further scientific inquiry rather than a claim to have solved the mystery of what happens after we die. Hawking remained a scientist to the end. Even while exploring these boundary-pushing ideas, he insisted they should be subject to the same rigorous analysis and testing as any scientific theory. These considerations should not be treated as mystical revelations but as hypotheses to be tested and refined, he wrote. The fact that they deal with consciousness and death doesn't exempt them from scientific scrutiny. The evolution of Hawking's thinking offers a powerful reminder that great scientific minds don't become rigid in their views but remain open to new possibilities, even those that challenge their previous positions. His willingness to reconsider fundamental questions about consciousness and its relationship to physical reality exemplifies the true spirit of scientific inquiry. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, Hawking once wrote. It is the illusion of knowledge. His final intellectual journey demonstrates his commitment to challenging even his own illusions of knowledge, to questioning assumptions that most scientists take for granted about the nature of consciousness and its fate at death. This legacy invites us all, scientists and non-scientists alike, to approach these profound questions with both open-minded curiosity and rigorous critical thinking. The mystery of consciousness after death remains unsolved, but Hawking's final contributions suggest that science, rather than retreating from such questions, might be entering an era where it can address them in new and profound ways. As Hawking himself wrote in what would be his final reflection on the subject, "The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. The true nature of consciousness may be the strangest aspect of all, and its potential persistence beyond physical death may eventually be understood not as a supernatural phenomenon but as a natural feature of a quantum reality we are only beginning to comprehend. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Hawking's intellectual legacy is not to accept or reject these final thoughts, but to carry forward the spirit of fearless inquiry that produced them, continuing to explore the deepest mysteries of existence with both scientific rigor and boundless imagination.